Trump right now is still trying to pursue a peace deal with the Russians. It has made no material success on the battlefield, and the Russians continue to deny a meeting between Putin and Zelensky, even though Trump said that would be the next step. And that has been the step he has demanded for months and months and months, and they once again have rejected it. Now, the White House is still talking in a way that seems both sidesy, despite threats of further retaliations. And every day I wake up, I really do not know what side of the bed Trump's going to wake up on this, what he's going to be advised, and what decision he's going to end up taking. He says in one breath that if we go into this meeting in Anchorage and come out of it without a ceasefire, then the meeting will be a failure. Then he leaves that meeting, says it's a 10 out of 10, and they're not even pursuing a ceasefire anymore. So, you know, it really, like, what day of the week, what Trump you're going to get, you really don't know. But, and this was always my fear with Trump, is just the flip-floppiness, how sporadic he acts and behaves. But we're deep into this negotiation process. Intelligence support is still being provided. Even if long-range strikes have to be personally approved by Pete Hegseth, they haven't all been taken away. There is a mechanism in place for weapons to flow into Europe and then flow from there to Ukraine. Even if it isn't a lot of weapons, even if it's a weapons deal and it's not aids package, even if it isn't directly to Ukraine, there's still some mechanisms there. But every time we run into the cold hard fact that the Russians aren't being serious when it comes to these negotiations, despite every baby step that might be taken, Trump continues to live in this negotiated pieces right around the corner attitude. And every time he steps out of that psychosis, he steps back into it within a moment's notice. And now, after Russia has gone to Alaska, Putin went to Anchorage, they shook hands, they did this whole shebang where he said he'd be disappointed if it didn't have a ceasefire. 2 weeks later, we get a massive attack on central Kiev. 32 missiles, 598, nearly 600 attack drones. This is one of the largest attacks on Kiev for the entire war. The footage you see right here is of 2 missiles striking in central Kiev and the damage to local residential buildings and the British Council building. Look, these types of attacks are not turning down. They are escalating. These attacks are becoming larger and larger and larger, and they are becoming more frequent. The Russians are trying to turn up the heat at the same time that they talk as if they are interested in peace. And then they make demands like giving up Sloviansk and Kramatorsk and X, Y, and Z that are just unattainable through negotiations. These are things that they know the Ukrainians cannot give up for both strategic and national defense reasons. And when I say national defense reasons, I mean, and strategic reasons, I mean how defensible they are, on top of the humanitarian reasons, on top of the principle of the matter. And so they are not engaging in a way that is susceptible to peace. They are increasing the pressure. And not only are they increasing the pressure, but they are increasing the pressure on a way that is bringing more terror to civilians. August was the most deadly month for civilians in Ukraine for the entirety of the war outside of the opening months. So for the last 3 years, we have not been as deadly. The war has not been as deadly as it is right now for Ukrainian civilians. And these are due to these large-scale strikes on big cities, the human safari, drone hunting on the front lines, and of course, the continual spillover into civilian homes of Russian artillery fire. But big attacks like this are a big contributor to that, to the Russians escalating attacks, but also escalating attacks that are bringing more terror to civilians. This is an old post that says 15 people are dead. The number is now 22, and 4 of them are children. Many other are injured, wounded. When you get hurt in war, you're not injured, you're wounded, aren't you? But at the same time that this is happening, the same day, they're saying, we're still interested in negotiating. We're still interested. And I quote, Russia remains interested in continuing negotiations. This is from Peskov, Putin's press secretary. Look, if they continue to escalate offensive operations on the front line, if they continue to escalate air attacks, while continue to drag on the president who said he wanted it done in 24 hours into the 8th, going on ninth month, a year of dragging your feet is pathetic from the president of the United States. A year of doing nothing but talking and talking and talking and talking is pathetic from the United States. At a certain point, you need to realize on a base level, not just for this, but for every diplomatic engagement you're going to engage in the future, that they're giving you the runaround. Because if they ain't going to come to the table and negotiate peace with how you've set the table currently, you got to set the table differently. You got to change out a few of the forks for a few knives, buddy. You need to decide, hey, if this ain't the rules that they're going to apply by, rules that we're willing to live with, then we got to change the game. We need to change the pressure. We need to change the conditions that led to them thinking they could treat us this way, treat Ukraine this way, treat Europe this way, and treat international law this way. That means making it so that each assault the Russians engage in come with higher and higher damage to their war-making effort, this means bringing on the economic pressure more and more and more. It means that when we get reports like this, Russia's idle oil refinery capacity record high after Ukrainian drone attacks. Ukraine, due to their strikes, has done so much damage to Russian oil refineries that Russia currently is not exporting gas. They have suspended gas exports. Russia, the energy giant, in order to help stabilize domestic prices, because year on year, there's been a 30% increase in prices on the St. Petersburg Stock Exchange. So the prices have increased. There is also a problem of shortages. Now, it depends on where you are. If you're in Moscow, it's not as bad. But if you're in different regions, there are quite big queues for gasoline. And the reason this is for a few reasons, but the big contributing factor that is, on the tip of the tongue of Russian propagandists, but they're very scared to say it directly out loud, is that the Ukrainian drone war has really taken off. The Ukrainians are producing more and more drones than ever, and they're engaging in longer and longer and bigger long-range drone attacks that are going deeper into Russia and hitting more targets in Russia. And they're not just hitting production facilities, they're also targeting oil refineries, which is how you make higher-priced product out of your crude in order to make something that you can sell for big bucks on the international market, get more money from the Indians, get more money from the Chinese. You target those refineries, they got to sell that in crude. They're making a lot less money. A third of the Russian budget comes from that energy market. If they lose that money, they can't fund the war. Point blank, period. When 30 to over 40% of the Russian budget is dedicated towards the war, a 15%, if they lost half of that, that would be unsustainable. Any growing pressure monetarily in that way is going to hurt the Russian war effort, or at least hurt the Russian state that supports it. And so this campaign has led to a 17% drop in this Russian oil refinery, 17% disabled by Ukrainian strikes. That's very significant. Again, that is a record high, and that is leading to shortages, that is leading to delays and big lines and queues in certain Russian regions, that's leading to suspension in gas exports. And this campaign feels like the exact thing that someone like Donald Trump would want in order to increase pressure on the Russians to bring them to the negotiating table, to make them say, man, this war is too expensive. We have to pay more and more and more for older and older and older men. The average age of a Russian soldier is between the age of 45 and 65 now. That's a problem. If you're in the Russian authority paying more money to recruit older and older men, you can't endlessly spin that. You can't spin that drain forever. And then when the economic costs continue to bear down, as your refineries are getting targeted, as the cost of living continues to be squeezed, as pensions continue to be put under pressure. And that's not even to talk about the massive costs of having to support all these veterans and amputees after the war. And so you want to increase that pressure to bring them to the negotiating table. In fact, Donald Trump had previously expressed to Zelensky that exact sentiment. You know, you got to bring the war to them. You got to go on the offense. You got to do something to get something, was the idea that Trump was putting across to them. And so this, to me, is the Ukrainians doing something to get something. And for this month, the Ukrainians have been doing more strikes on Russian oil refineries than on any other month. So it's right now that the Ukrainians are doing it. They have increased their capacity. According to the Ukrainian government numbers, they should be producing more long-range drones this year than every other year of the war combined. Even if you cut that number in half, it would still clear that standard. Combined. Even if you cut it in half. And it's the Russians themselves that are reporting these high numbers, plus 100 drones a day. It's the Russians themselves reporting those drones that they shot down. So you don't just need to believe the Ukrainians, you can believe the Russians, you can believe the footage, you can believe the cues of trucks trying to get gas. So you have on one side residential buildings getting struck and drones flying over buildings running out of energy before slamming into residential homes, killing children, killing the elderly, killing well over 22 people in their homes. Well, killing 22 people at least in their homes. Some people are still in critical condition. And what is, by the way, I could do this all day. I could show you footage from here, Sauna the Human Safari, and say, oh, also this happened. This is a photo of a passenger train from Kiev to Kharkiv, which is one of the major ways. This train was one of the major ways civilians used to travel between the cities. That was struck and destroyed by the Russians. I've used this train many times. I know my friend Anna has used this train many times. It is one of the main ways to get back and forth. I guess I'll have to find another way now. So you look at these two types of war that are being engaged in. One is leading to much more civilian casualties that has been condemned by the United Nations, that's been condemned by the Trump administration, the Biden administration, these types of attacks. And then you have the other, which is actively applying pressure economically on the means by which Russia supports the war. That is not hitting residential homes in large amounts. That is not these drones leading to these types of casualty numbers in Russia. And then you get this from Caroline Levitt.
Both sides of this war are not ready to end it themselves. The president wants it to end, but the leaders of these two countries need it to end and want it to end, must want it to end as well. And I think the president will make some additional statements on this later.
And then when directly asked, Caroline Levitt, the president's press secretary, about these strikes that killed all these civilians, she said, and I quote, "Russia launched this attack on Kiev. And likewise, Ukraine recently dealt a blow to Russia's oil refineries." One is an economic mechanism by which Russia funds the war effort. The other was largely civilian homes and the British consulate building. This is not comparable. There's an ethical difference between blowing up an oil refinery that Trump himself is saying, like, hey, put more pressure on while Trump himself is asking for more pressure on the Russians from the Ukrainians. He's asked for those things in private talks with Zelensky. Well, he's asking for that, punishing them as to say, oh, well, a strike on an oil refinery, a strike on an apartment complex. What's the difference? The difference is quite steep. One is the engine by which a nation uses to invade the other. The other is the people by which the nation is. The difference is quite substantial. And the fact that it's being treated like it isn't substantial means that the Russians will view America's position on it as not substantial and think, hey, we can do big attacks like this and not endanger negotiations whatsoever. I mean, negotiations have been dragging on for 8 months. They've been going on for 9 months. Gonna be soon. We're going on to 9 months now. We're going on soon. It'll be a year of this. And if after a year of this, you're doing strikes like this, and that isn't killing talks, at the start of the war, Bucha was a big contributor. The Bucha massacre was a big contributor as to why talks between the Ukrainians and the Russians broke down. But if instances like this don't change the conversation, then the Russians believe that there's no reason for them to hold back on instances like this. They have no consequences for instances like this outside of the outrage of the Ukrainian public that they've been pummeling for the better part of 4 years. Mind you, the only consequence to date that you can give Trump is his imposed 50% tariff on India. Mind you, the only difference between this tariff and the China tariff of 30%, which is unrelated to the war in Ukraine, is 20%, a 20% difference. And that difference has also not again been applied to China, which also heavily supports the Russian economy. So we're talking about a 20% tariff difference between them and the Chinese. And it's only again applied on the Indians and not the Chinese. Now, will this hurt Indian manufacturers that want to sell it in the United States? Absolutely, it will. Has this gotten a concession out of the Indian government? Not yet. May it in the future? I don't know. It also depends on how far Trump is willing to go with these threats, and if he can shake that image of Taco Trump. If he can shake the image that he institutes a tariff, then he runs off the tariff. He institutes a tariff, and then he takes off the tariff. And when Donald Trump has not made it seem like Ukraine is a priority for him, and when the Indians have seen many other instances where Trump is chickened out, I mean, how much could you really blame the Indians if they were to just take a seat back and say, let's wait a month or two and see if Trump maybe just changes his mind and says, and takes some, rhetorical concession where we say we want peace or something. So this is the only threat Trump has made good on after dozens of threats in other manners have not been delivered on, after dozens of red lines have been drawn, 100 days, 24 hours, 2 weeks, 2 weeks, 2 weeks. Oh, you better sign a ceasefire this time or we're going to sanction you with the Europeans. Nothing came. I mean, this whole conference in Alaska was based off of another deadline that was supposed to end, a 12-day deadline that was shortened from a 50-day deadline, that then got pivoted into a diplomatic victory for the Russians, where they continue to do the ring around with Trump, and they got to have the whole dog and pony show with a red carpet rolled out by U.S. soldiers in Anchorage, Alaska. So the consequences have not been substantial enough to convince the Russians that we're serious. The consequences so far have been pitter-patter, have been stuff that almost seems like you're hitting off the checklist to make it seem like you're not 100% just shoving a knife into Ukraine's back. And so until they make the Russians see more of this or feel pressure in a way that lets them know that this war cannot continue as is, that they have to find an off-ramp, then any sweetening of the deal to make the off-ramp seem sweeter is not going to work. Again, the Russians cannot just be convinced through patty cake into negotiating. It's not going to work. You have to compel them. That doesn't mean you go out there and make ridiculous demands, but it means you make clear that if they don't want to make a deal, it's going to be more painful than just making the deal now and ripping off the Band-Aid of telling your people you're not going to get everything you want.